Hi. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nikos Katrakis. I'm an independent consulting actuary, and I'm hosting today's CPD section organized by the Network of Consulting Actuaries UK. We are committed to developing and sharing knowledge among actuaries. Our aim is to provide excellent actuarial service to insurance company clients. Today's session is titled Why Finance is Poor at Tackling Climate Change and What That Means for Actuaries, and is hosted by Mike Clark. Mike is a founder director of Ario Advisory, a responsible investment advisory firm. He represents IFOA on the Advisory Council of the Oxford Smith School. He spent nearly 4 years as an ed at Brunel, was specialist advisor to the House of Commons Environmental Audit Committee for their 2018 Green Finance Inquiry, and continues to be involved with the work of select committees. He was a member of the team that built what became GFANZ, which I believe stands for Glasgow Financial Alliance to Net Zero, Mike. I've got one. He's currently a member of numerous IFOA climate-related working parties. He's curated the IFOA climate reading list. Much of his work across the financial system focuses on the financial risks of climate change and the uncertainty which lies beyond risk. I know Mike from Russell Investments, where he spent more than 20 years. Prior to that, roles included head of fixed income at a major insurer. He's currently trying to persuade the Bank of England and evidently this audience that the CBES modeling is not fit for purpose. Victory is assured, but some way off. This CPD session counts for up to 1 hour of your CPD, provided it is relevant to the nature of your work and addresses a personal development need. Obviously, Mike is talking for him in his own personal capacity. The views expressed in this presentation are his and not necessarily the views of the Network of Consulting Actuaries or the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. And I think you can submit questions at any point. Mike will decide when to answer them. To be honest, we expect this to be more of a dialogue. Mike will give an introduction, but hopefully this will be more of a discussion than rather than a monologue. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Mike. Thanks.
Nikos, thank you very much. Good day to everybody. And thanks to NOCA, if I've pronounced it right. It's a relatively new acronym to me for this opportunity. As Nikos says, I would love this to be a discussion, so I'm going to rattle through a few slides and then just see where this goes. So the title is Why Finance is Poor at Tackling Climate Change, and then the second part is where you're going to do some work. What does that mean for actuaries? So there's a few prompts, and just to be provocative, I've said stranded economics and stranded climate scenarios. Now I'm trying to change the slide, and we've got there. So a few questions for you to think about. How well do governments and regulators manage systemic risk? The slight rhetorical question has a not very well answer from me. Public policy can do it poorly. There's too much reliance, I suggest, on economists and also the theory of externalities. Externalities exist, but public policy can be pretty poor at managing those externalities. Think climate, possibly think cyber. For those of you in the UK, how well did the 2018 Bank of England stress test anticipate the LDI episode? I suggest not that well. How well do NGOs scenarios, so in the UK, that would be CBES, the Climate Biennial Exploratory Scenario Exercise, do their job? My answer is rather badly. And just being slightly philosophical, does the consumer do what the citizen might choose not to do? The next slide is quite an old slide of mine as I began to think about this some years ago. I thought about risk through the SDG lens, the risk for citizens, and the stuff I was brought up on, MPT, modern portfolio theory, and all those good things listed on the right hand of that slide. Now, official scenarios. So NGFS, or locally in the UK, CBES. Why are these scenarios not decision useful? And the background of this is that over a year ago, with a couple of colleagues across the industry, we set up the RWCS Real World Climate Scenario Initiative, because it was pretty clear that the official scenarios were not fit for the real world. So why? Well, ignoring key risks and opportunities encourages a lack of urgency. We need emissions cuts of 8% per annum to 2030 to halve them. How well are we doing? Probably rather badly. If you're doing transition planning, a 30-year horizon is not very good. You need short-term scenarios. And you also need to remember that your organization's success depends on others being successful. It is no good if you are sustainable, but the world is going to hell in a handbasket. Let's realize that climate is not a major uncertainty in the next few years. It's just getting worse. But separating chronic climate risk from acute weather risks helps us realize the problem. I could suggest that we don't really have a climate problem, we have a behavior problem, and events like COVID in Ukraine show short-term volatility can accelerate structural change. Think of Germany's economic policy, think of other things that can accelerate structural change. And if you're familiar with VUCA, of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and I think it's ambiguity, some of us talk about living on planet VUCA, not planet NGFS. Digging a little bit into the weeds, some of you will be familiar with integrated assessment models, known to their friends as IAMS, but if you dig into them, the sort of economic foundation is often a general equilibrium model. It's all nice and smooth and things just happen in a sort of smooth way. Life's not like that. Climate change doesn't have a general equilibrium, which is a bit of a problem for much economics. And if we're really digging in IAMS, there's a thing called the damage function, which does what it says on the tin, and they lead to very modest GDP losses. And in fact, the damage functions are damaged. Narratives eat modeling for breakfast is one of the taglines of RWCS, the initiative I mentioned. Asking the right questions is important. And of those of you familiar with scenario work know that narratives illuminate the risk opportunity drivers, an appropriate time horizon, and the scope. So models are useful tools, and that's quite helpful since many actuaries like models, but we need to ask the right questions first. Asset owners are concerned about the outlook for asset prices. Where are asset prices in IAMS? Probably invisible. Scenarios are descriptions of plausible futures, so they help us to think about the possible, think about the future. Where possible, in italics, where possible, modeling can help clarify and quantify the narratives. But if the narratives are going to be useful, they need to be actionable for the purpose in hand. And we mustn't forget that models embody the narratives of the modelers. And some of the models might say, I'm an economist. This is a frame of some work we're doing. I can discuss it in the Q&A, but basically, my colleague Mark Cliff, who is one of the 3 co-conveners of RWCS, says when you do scenarios, identify the uncertainties and put them into the scenario drivers. And we have chosen policy intervention, fast and slow, high and low, market dynamism, fast and slow, high and low. And here are 4 scenarios. Let's concentrate on the bottom left, which is probably where we sort of feel we are, which we've nicely called meltdown. And that's a bit of a disaster. If everything was rosy, head to the top left, markets dynamic, policy dynamic. And we call that the roaring 20s. So just think about scenarios. There's no modeling here. We're just telling stories about politics, growth, and all lots of other things. So that's just framework. I can elaborate on that in the Q&A. And just to prove that we're not mad, in the UK, the Financial Services and Markets Bill is going to the House of Lords. It's done the Commons. I draw your attention to the excellent Amendment 168, tabled by Baroness Bryony Worthington on the 1st of March. In that speech, I've just extracted some things which you can read later, but basically this speech tears apart the Bank of England CBES. Let's do the italics bit. The whole streamlined, reassuring and seemingly precise approach is hopelessly wrong. That was my bold. And a reduction in GDP growth of only 12 basis points is very poorly aligned with the scientific consensus. In summary, says Bryony, the existing models aren't up to the job, systematically understate costs related to both transition and physical risk. And that's probably a disappointment because I'm sure some of the listeners are actually doing some excellent CBES work within the constraints of the regulatory environment. And I love Bryony's phrase at the bottom, where costs cannot be quantified, they should not be set aside, or rather, efforts should be made to understand and account for them. Wise words from a politician in the House of Lords. In fact, I might just stick with that for a second. If you go to that speech and the government's limp reply, it has resulted in a letter signed by me, a leading climate scientist, a pension fiduciary, and 2 others to Baroness Penn, for rebutting the points of her limp reply. So this is an ongoing conversation, and we'll see where it goes. The letter that we wrote is not public. It might be public sometime. We just need to see how that conversation goes. Oh, this is a bit of a mind-stretching one, but as we began to think about scenarios, we decided that there are 3 domains, as you can see: policy, the real economy, will solve it, and finance. And we probably need narratives to expose the truth in those 3 domains, because asset owners get to this pretty quickly, pension fund trustees. That is where narratives are just beginning to gain some traction. And then the idea about this climate science plus humanity meta scenarios would be the notion that if UNFCCC, which is the United Nations bit that runs the COP process, actually had a few scenarios which drew out, if you like, policy versus markets, as I've outlined, we might actually expose the truth, which is worse than we think. So I said you were going to do some work, but here's some issues you might like to consider. So we'll move to the Q&A in a moment. This is one that I have used. The first one is one I've used already with a scheme actuary or 2. There is some interesting work published by pension funds in the UK, which have exciting reductions in expected return along the lines of the following. At 1.6 degrees above, the reduction in expected return on our fund is 0.0% per annum. At 4 degrees above, the reduction in expected return on our pension fund is 1% per annum. This would seem to ignore that the insurance industry has probably disappeared and economic activity may be rather modest. So the question I asked to a scheme actuary as he sees this work pass across his client's trustee table, don't you know enough about climate science to challenge those numbers your client is publishing? Or if you did know enough, could you have failed in your duty to your client by not challenging that nonsense? The next question is triggered by a talk I gave to last year's annual conference on loss and damage, the COP process around loss and damage. And I asked some good questions on tail risks, which I answered very badly. And it became clear that, tail risks is sort of where we tend to stop, but we need to look behind the tail risks as outcomes and think about what created them. So my question here is, how fat tail is fat enough for you? Double materiality is a useful concept. It's in the investment world, what the world is doing to the company. Double materiality is what the company is doing to the world. So banks financing emissions would be an example of double materiality. I think there's reputation litigation risks for all of us. And then ending on a positive note, what opportunities do you see for finance, risk and uncertainty experts? Guess which profession that is. And also I've been involved in a conversation led by Louise Pryor recently where we got on to fairness. So I think combining finance, risk, uncertainty and fairness is a great actuarial opportunity. And on that note, I've done what I said and kept my initial remarks to 15 minutes. So I'm going to pause there and let's see if we've got some questions. I can't see them, Nikos, so perhaps you can lead the questions. I'll leave the slide up for a bit, but then I might remove it. So questions. We had one from Nikki, didn't we, at the beginning? Nikos, you're on mute still.
So I've been talking the last 2 minutes and nobody has heard what I've been saying. I was thinking that probably you have shocked everybody by sticking to what you said you would do. And some of our audience may be used to a Q&A session being 10 to 15 minutes in the end. But obviously this one is a bit longer. And rightly so. I think Matt raised his hand at some point, Matt Modisett.
Can he come off mute? Can he come off mute and ask it orally?
I'll see if I can unmute him somehow.
If you go to participants, can you do it that way?
Yeah, maybe he's on top of my list. There he is. Hi, Matt. Can you
hear me now?
Yes, we can. Sorry for the delay.
No trouble at all. It's technology. It's like that. Hi, Mike. Thanks for the brief intro to warm us up for having comments. I guess I'll start with kind of a double-barreled comment. The one that I have is, who is modeling society? So the example that causes that question is, if we are trying to make our asset portfolio look green, we might get out of emitting the different companies as our investments. That might mean that we under-invest in the entire sector of energy, basically washing our hands of the issue. That, I think, should not be a green type of strategy, because we should be investing in alternative energy to try to get out of it. If we just simply divest of emitters, that has the double advantages of not doing anything positive to a transition. Meanwhile, it sells it off to somebody else who may not have the same type of professional requirements that we have to do something good for society.
Okay, so, that's a great question, which I saw at least 2.5 pieces of. So I'll go it this way. Nobody's modeling society. But if you buy the idea that narratives are helpful, then I pass you back to that 4-blob chart near the end, and narratives about how society might behave could be an interesting way in beginning to address that question. On the divest point, I get what you're saying, but the key point is that public policy needs to make the recipient of that potential, let's call it a fossil fuel something, uncomfortable economically. So it is a weak argument to say that divestment is bad. I've already crafted a IMA, investment management agreement clause, for a pension fund, which said that dear investment manager, it was bond manager, dear investment manager, if the green capex of this issuer is inadequate, you will exclude them from the investable universe. Because as a citizen, I wish less emissions to be financed next year over this year and the following year after next year and so on. So it is necessary that we view this, you're probably a systems thinker, it's necessary to think of this in systems terms and realize that public policy has to make the presumed disadvantage of divestment be temporary. Do you want to come back on that?
I get where, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
I get where you're coming from, although I would challenge your challenge to my statement.
Good.
I think the question is not that I want to finance emissions less. The real question is, I would like to have less investments. And just because we have control or say or regulations over some investment funds who get rid of things does not prevent other people outside of our regulations, like oil producing countries, to step up and make the investment. So I think simply getting the people out of our remit to not do the financing is insufficient to the task.
Okay, then I need to respond. So there's nobody outside our remit, is the first point. So as we head towards lower emissions, there will be political pressure. And if you want to visit a discussion I'm having with a fine colleague in the new IFA communities, that was a plug for communities, I guess, Saudi Arabia is probably going to be the last oil producer standing. So increasingly, whether it's by CBAMs, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, or other ways, you get to the politics as well as the capitalism of the private sector.
So you claim that we regulate the whole world?
No, I didn't say that. I said
you said nobody's outside of our remit.
We influence regulation. So going back to Bryony Worthington's speech, I helped Bryony write that. The fact that the government have declined to engage with the issue doesn't mean we stop. So it is quite possible for actuaries to engage in public policy, as IFOA does, as I do. And if you want an interesting conversation you're not that familiar with, there's a conversation which is either referred to as the Bridgetown Agenda, led by the fine Prime Minister of a Caribbean island, which combines with the Bretton Woods plus 80 conversation, which is a recalibration of the global financial architecture, bringing in more risk, good for actuaries, and less economics, which is failing. So I assert that no place is outside our influence. I don't say we regulate, I say we influence.
So I missed the point maybe. If we have all this influence, why isn't it working so far?
Because we have not used it, and the world has only become, you know, the Bridgetown, are you familiar with the Bridgetown Agenda?
Why don't you tell everybody?
Okay, so it's Mia Mottley is the Prime Minister, I think it's Barbados, which has brought to the COP discussions the idea that the global financial architecture is not fit for purpose. If you look at that in a systems way, we probably started back in 2015, Paris, Article 2.1c. My good friend Steve Waygood at Aviva realized that whereas Article 2.1a and 2.1b were about the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. Sorry, I'm a bit of an acronym junkie and have to remember what it actually stands for. Article 2.1c talks about the financial flows. So Steve decided that the world did not have a CFO to implement Article 2.1c. So he and a group of us, including me, built GFANS and sold it to Carney. So these things take time. I can tell you the state of play in a number of places and encourage you to join the whatever you want it to be. But in a sense, this is a systemic world problem and it needs interventions to accelerate the action I'm suggesting. So if you want to join the Bretton Woods plus 80 conversation, which is basically, do we have some conference in 2024, which builds on the 1944 Bretton Woods, which effectively brings more risk, especially systemic risk, into finance. That would be a good thing, I assert. Thanks for the challenge, Matt. We need the challenges.
Thanks, Matt. That was a really interesting point. And thanks, Mike, for answering that as well. I don't know, maybe it's worth moving to a slightly different angle of it. Nikki has asked a question and Sam has asked another question. I don't know if you can see them or you want me to read them.
Bless you. Okay, I'll take Nikki's.
Okay.
The difference between stress testing and scenario analysis. Let's have a go. So thanks for that, Nikki. It's a while since we've spoken. Scenario analysis is a tool. So NGFS did good things by picking up TCFD's scenarios are necessary. Of course, because finance is sort of run by economists and modeling, what did we do? We rushed off and modeled. So that is why the official scenario analysis is modeling. I get that. Stress testing is probably a regulatory activity which says we are going to stress test your organization against possible stresses. And since this is more prevalent in banking, and you know more about banking, you may want to come back at me. So that is, stress testing is a regulatory activity. It could actually be a corporate activity. A corporate could stress test itself. If the stress test is essentially only stressing an organization, then it is probably the case that systemic risk is out with the stress test. So if we look at Silicon Valley Bank, if we look at Credit Suisse, if we look at the banking sector, we sort of realize that even goodish stress testing may require short-term adaptation. And that gets to the whole discussion about AT1 bonds. So I think the difference is fundamentally a tool, scenario analysis, and we are suggesting that narratives are a better approach to scenarios than modeling initially. You can get to modeling, but you have to ask the right questions first. And stress testing is the activity which is probably principally regulatory. If Nikki's online and wants to open a mic, if there's a follow-up, happy to do it. Okay, well, while Nikki's pondering, let me move to Sam's. Well, if I really want to scare you, and ex-President Trump wouldn't like this one, Sam, you're an insurance company, and I need to tell you that next year...
Sorry, Mike, it's okay. I'm just going to read the question because I'm not sure the whole audience can see it.
Please read the question, then I'll answer.
So Sam is asking, what sort of insurance impact in regulatory change do you see coming down the line in relation to climate change?
Okay, well, let's give the scary answer first, then I'll give a slightly softer one. So, Sam, you are the chief executive of insurance company. I'm terribly sorry, but I'm the insurance regulator, and next year I'm going to regulate, as in limit, the emissions you can insure. Because as a citizen, I wish fewer emissions to be insured next year than this, and the only way I can do that is to put a cap on your ability to insure them. So I can't say that's coming down the line anytime soon, but that helps us to think about what might need to be done. And like all these good ideas, it wasn't mine, and it came out in a paper a couple of years ago. More generally, the big problem in insurance, if there's a bigger one, please tell me, is that annual repricing does not capture systemic risk. So ultimately, as I put up my prices, the insured may not afford them, so there's less insurance, or the government caps my premiums, which of course is firstly an actuarial insult, and secondly, doesn't give the right price signals to the market, because behind the government capping premiums is the unwitting citizen who is now the underwriter. And again, if Sam wants to come back in open mic, happy to tackle it.
Let's see if I can let Sam talk. Hi, Sam. If you want, you can.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can.
Great, thanks for the response. That's really good discussion generally, and interested about this regulatory change bit, but specifically sort of with Solvency II reform and the Sam Wood speech recently, and the kind of angle in there about opening up investment with sort of matching adjustment eligibility being kind of relaxed. That sort of suggested that that's going to be more of a focus in insurance regulatory change, hence the question. But what you've suggested there is a lot more. It sounds like a lot further down the line and a lot scarier.
Yes.
Hence the question. I mean, by extension, is there anything sort of similar in like pensions space that's imminent or?
Oh, that's a better question than you realise, he said slightly condescendingly. Yes, but it's not quite in the way that you might be suggesting. Let's see if I can bring the pensions bit back in a minute. So it is possible that the Solvency II regulation relaxation will transfer some risk unwittingly to citizens, because depending on your view of what insurance companies will do with this increased flexibility, if they pay out lots of money to shareholders over time, that probably harms citizens' interests. If they invest overseas, because investment is a global activity, and why invest in the UK, I need to look globally. The sweet things they are saying to government may be just sweet things, and the government's desire to invest in the UK may be thwarted. I need to learn more about the Solvency II stuff, because I moved out of insurance, not quite when dinosaurs ruled the earth, but after 15 years. Moving on to pensions, it's a really good question, and it's a sort of hope offering, and it goes like this. In the banking and possibly insurance sector, but I'm going to do banking for a minute, and this is a UK comment, and this comes back to Nikki's question. The stress testing and scenario analysis is very weak. And if you look at the report published by, I think it's CFRF, which must be the Climate Finance Regulatory Forum, maybe, it's pretty clear that the participants in CBES have made it clear in this research done by my good friend Nicola Ranger and others that lots of things are not captured. So basically, whilst everybody is caught up in the UK in banking insurance with the CBES farrago, pension funds are interesting. So think of a pension fund. Let's pretend, Sam, that you are the chair of the investment committee and this conversation has happened. So I'm the modeler. I do a really excellent 2 years modeling, and I present it to the trustee board, investment committee, and say, look, so here's all our modeling. And you say, Sam says, Mike, that's really very clever, but how does it help us make decisions at the board level? And the simple answer is it doesn't. And I'm aware of at least 3 cases where this conversation has happened. So then the trustees say, well, just a minute, what do we do? Because the modeling just doesn't work. And the answer we offer is go to narratives. So going back to that 2x2 slide that I showed earlier, a third party, in fact, I can talk about this because I also talk about Exeter University before we're out. A third party is in the process of contracting with a leading UK pension fund to develop some narratives, 2x2 matrix, to assist the investment committee to think about the problem. Now, those of you who are familiar with the investment world will know all about the stuff on that slide: alpha, beta, capital asset pricing model, tracking error. Now, the problem with the way we think about beta, and I was brought up on this, is in terms of past investment returns. Now, if you pause for a minute, there is no risk in those past investment returns because they're outcomes. Risk is an ex-ante concept, which is a good friend of mine at Russell said, has an ex-post friend called pain. So begin to think of how you redo strategic asset allocation. I'm going to suggest you might think of it as strategic risk management. And so the pensions industry, no, that's not true. 1 or 2 pension funds who get this are beginning to explore how the heck they do strategic risk management without models. And I think the way it will go is as follows. So, Sam, I'm still placing you as the chair of the investment committee. I've presented you, and this will happen later this year, with some narratives, and they will stimulate your thinking. It's almost like sort of strategic ESG advice. You will draw on the experience of your board, and you will say, right, we need to discard our numeric thinking, which is pretty scary for all of us, and we need to think about strategic risk, mass migration, Republican president in 2024, China blockades Taiwan. What are the things that could affect risk in a climate context that make us think very differently about strategic risk management? Because for 30 years, we've just done beta. So long answer, but to a very good question, because pensions and asset owners who get this are probably actually the leaders in finance. 1 or 2 other data points. There is one pension fund who's done this a bit. They're a DC master trust, and they have a bit of a 10-year view, which is maybe on the longer side. And another leading pension fiduciary published a piece in IP&E probably a couple of months ago, which said climate scenarios, the solution of the problem. Let me stop there. Any comeback on that one, Sam? Or I'll move on to roll-offs.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sam. I mean, it's a really good question, Roloff, and my short answer is I don't know, but
I'll repeat Rolof's questions
Oh, yes,
for the
do.
benefit of our audience. Hi, Mike. One of the criticisms is that NGFS scenarios only focus on the economic side. How do we also cover the mortality, morbidity, persistency, loss of new business in your narratives?
Right, this is a really good question, and my answer will be pretty poor, but I owe Roloff a stab at it, and it goes like this. So Roloff, go back to the 4 blob slide, and I have tended to do most of my work in the bottom right, the finance bit. So I'm now, well, am I? No, I'm probably in insurance. So what I'm suggesting, and in fact, this has half come up. I'm thinking of the lady, sorry, this is a bit precise, but Roloff and I were in a conversation a week or 2 ago with a fine leader of climate stuff in a reinsurer. And I think my initial answer is, once you've realized, and I think you get to the finance and the assets first, is a problem. I think what you do is you build scenarios relevant to the board of the organization that combine stories about narratives, mortality, morbidity, loss of new business. So in the same way that Shell in the 80s started scenarios for Shell as an oil company, you introduce scenarios. You're going to have to come back on this, Roloff. You introduce scenarios at the board level, which recognize the uncertainties beyond risk of any parameter relative to a business model, mortality, morbidity, persistency, loss of new business. And you have to tell a story if you are, Roelof, the head of scenario modeling, which brings those issues to help the board's thinking. Now, it may well be you have to come a level beneath the board, and it may be that you actually do it for the executive. I'm thinking aloud here. You do it for the executive, but you say, as we get better at developing a business strategy that addresses all the things that are relevant to this business, mortality, morbidity, persistency, assets, loss of new business, we need to develop narratives that include scenarios for things. So clearly you go beyond climate here, so you suddenly have a pandemic where actually writing annuities is a jolly good thing because they all die off. I mean, you just bring the whole scenario concept.
Can't say that, Mike.
I just have. One of the things about scenarios is you can say things that are politically unacceptable.
I know.
If you say Trump re-elected, you upset half the people. If you say Trump not elected, you upset the other half. Yes. So one of the things about scenarios is you have to be happy to say things that are sort of a bit tricky. Do you want to come back, Roelof? Because it was a fantastic question, and I haven't really thought about it too much.
No, that's fine. Thanks for taking the question and complimenting it, and also thanks for all your work in this, Mike, and sharing all your knowledge with us.
Bless you.
I think it comes back to maybe a comment you made earlier, where we got into the numbers too quickly, and then the numbers came out looking wrong. And then you have to kind of go back and explain, but what's missing in the numbers? Yep. And that's where the narratives start coming into it, because, none of the stress tests looked at people getting, less healthy, people having to mass migrate and therefore lapsing their policies, people living in floodplains and being uninsurable. So I think, maybe there's some use in complementing the narratives with some numbers, but making sure that the focus is on the right bits, not just the numbers. And unfortunately, board members and financial directors, etc., tend to focus on the numbers first and then the narrative. So
I think you're absolutely right. And so here's a thought you have just co-created. It may mean that we realize that public policy is very bad at dealing with systemic risk.
Yeah.
So if your board in one of its scenarios began to realize that a lot of things were happening that were worsening health, then in companies engaged with public policy, you would make it clear that health was deteriorating, and actually public policy needs to get better at health. Because one of the things that I'm still trying to sort of work out a narrative around is the way public policy is very bad at dealing with systemic risk. Climate's obvious, cyber may be obvious, health may be less obvious, but possible. So I think one of the things that we are learning about the constraints of economics is it's pretty rubbish at risk. When I'm being unkind to economists, I say they just shrug their shoulders, say it was a shock and move on. But in sort of universal owner mode, there are no externalities, so there are no shocks. So I think you get to a rather interesting conversation about the finance sector telling government and non-financial regulators that we can only deal with financial risk, and systemic risk, which migrates to the finance sector, arises through weak management of systemic risk. That's sort of where I get with that one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks. No, that's good. I think maybe the one comment I would add was going back to Matt Modis's conversation is, if you start focusing on these narratives, you can actually help support the transition financing, because you can bring out all these bad things that are not in the numbers, that are not in the policy. But I
think that's a really important point. Let me emphasize that is a really important point.
Yeah.
And it was that point that helped me draw that 4 blob chart when my latest grandchild was asleep a couple of weeks ago. So I was thinking, you know, ultimately, if you take the top one, if UNFCCC owned some narratives that were realistic and not politically influenced, you'd actually achieve exactly what you said.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, I'm on a sort of, you know, narratives to save the world crusade, maybe.
Yeah.
We should probably go on.
No, keep going.
I was going to say we might need to move on if
Yeah.
Nikos wants to read anonymous attendees' questions from 12:35.
Perfect, and thank you. And I just want to motivate anybody else who wants to get involved in this, please contact Mike and or myself and the IFOA's board and, you know, all these things. So get involved, please, people.
Yes, and actually before we move to that, Nikos, just a quick plug. Some of you will be aware, if not please be, of the paper that IFOA did with Sir David King's Climate Crisis Advisory Group. I think that's the right name for COP27. There is another paper which I reviewed yesterday, which is doing more of the bringing risk into this conversation. It actually has quite a good poke at CBES, which of course I strongly support, and it is aligned with some other work which will be published possibly even this month, which is funded by philanthropy, owned by Carbon Tracker, and done by a very wise economist, which basically points out that the damage functions in the IAMs, the integrated assessment models, are damaged. And for 25 years, the work that Nordhaus, the fine economist who first brought economics to climate science, but some of the assumptions in that work were great 25 years ago, but are now no longer valid. So the IAM sort of collapse. So just plenty going on. Nikos, anonymous attendee, question at 12:35. Please read it.
Thanks, Mike. I'll read the question. Just a comment. You mentioned a couple of papers. I wonder if you could send us links to those. I'm quite happy to read papers in my spare time and try to understand things better.
I'll do my best. I'm so busy disrupting the world, I forget to do things like that, but I'll do my best.
That's fine. Going to the anonymous attendee, how do you reconcile the narrative-based approach suggested with the need for using some level of quantitative outputs in order to get decision makers to allocate even more resources to this space? We know there are a lot of blind spots with modeling. However, how does one strike the right balance between qualitative and quantitative outputs as to ensure the appropriate message is getting across? I think this is a really good question, and I think Roloff touched on that as well.
It's a great question, and I'm going to try and pick it up into various bits. In one sense, we don't know what the right balance of anything is. We just know there's not enough resource tackling this problem. So, you know, we'd go into the fact that finance people are brought up on finance theory. So in my world, that's capital asset pricing model, alpha, beta, etc. I was chairing an event last year, and one very honest participant said, I wasn't brought up to do this stuff. I'm good at finance, but how the heck do I do all this stuff? And that highlights the necessity for those of us who regard ourselves as finance people to be more open to, if you like, reframing some of the way we think about the problems. So I think there's a narrative story there. The very first bit of the question, we're actually grappling with that as we speak. Because the world is doing modeling, we are not saying modeling is not worth doing. What we're saying is it's only worth doing modeling when it's going to help. And the minute you have general equilibrium, and this is a sort of pokered economist, I guess, if you've got general equilibrium in the model, you sort of know it's not going to work, because if I understand it correctly, as you move away from general equilibrium in the general equilibrium model, that's a cost. actually it's a benefit because you're moving to a different position, a different equilibrium, a different place. So there's there's some sort of fundamental thoughts. I actually think you don't, in policy, you don't need quantitative output. So if I go back to this engagement with Baroness Penn, who I'm slightly worried to discover is now chairing the Transition Plan Task Force, displacing John Glenn, you actually just need to make an argument. At the end of the day, politics is narratives, and good narratives should win the day. I nearly made a Brexit comment. Good narratives should win the day. So I think part of the challenge is developing powerful narratives that accelerate behavior change. So moving slightly beyond the modeling and going back to that early divest point, if we are able to tell compelling narratives about the existential nature of this problem, I have publicly called Sam Wood's CBES speech of probably May last year unintentional regulatory greenwashing. Hopefully unintentional keeps the lawyers away, but if the modelling is as bad as I assert, you cannot say the profits hit will only be 10 to 15% because you just don't know. So I think the best I can offer you here is as follows. There's a firm called Autec who I work with, so I guess this is promotion, but that's the way of life. They do some very good modelling using Cambridge econometrics, and I think the model is called E3ME. But even in that work, not everybody uses a modelling module, which I believe is called FTT, and don't quote me on this because this is way outside my expertise. But basically, you can begin to model some things using expert judgment, which supports. Sorry, I was just confused by Nikki's Greek, which supports decision making. So I think all the time you're looking to support decision making. And I've actually just lost the question which I was looking at, so I'm looking at answered. So let me just go back to the question. Sorry, Nikos. So, I think it's, in all cases, it's realizing that modeling doesn't capture enough of the truth. Oh, we haven't talked about tipping points. We should talk about tipping points.
Yes, we should.
That's
a very good point. I was going to suggest something. There are some.
Oh, right.
This is maybe, well, this is not remotely climate change, because this reflects the reality of my of my home country, Greece, where a few years ago, well, we have fires every year in Greece. More recently, because of climate change, we have even more of those. But a fire that happened a few years ago killed more than 100 people, and resulted in the government being dethroned by another government. And it might be a good introduction to what you wanted to say about tipping points, Mike.
It's a super introduction. Thank you. So it goes like this. Tipping points, we're very familiar with tipping points in climate science. I saw a great slide yesterday from my newish friend, Tim Lenton, based at Exeter, who is one of the world's leading climate scientists on tipping points, and probably only about 30 understand them at all. And I was going to retitle his slide, which had a scientific title, with "Welcome to the tipping points coming to an Earth near you." So that's the climate science we get. And part of this is reconnecting finance with climate science and kicking out the dodgy economics. Now, you don't have to restrict tipping points to climate science. So if you go back to that 2x2 matrix that I showed earlier, one of the features of the top right, so success, roaring 20s, we might even do Paris, is talking about positive tipping points, because there is another aspect of this whole thing, which says, if I tell you stories about about good things that other people are doing, that will increase your agency. Agency is your willingness and ability to act. So I think one of the things we are going to need to bring into narratives is tipping points. It could be, it could be a Labour government, lots of green things in the UK. It could be citizens realizing there really is a problem. It could be the climate majority project in the UK. There's a whole number of tipping points. They can be in industries. There's the S-curves of technology. So I think tipping points, I think the headline I had for some piece of work was mind the model gap. There's plenty of tipping points in there. I think that's what I came up with yesterday. And I think tipping points are absent, and I should have mentioned those earlier. I'm going to just come back on Nikki. So she's mentioned CFRF in the questions.
By the way, I'll make a quick comment. Matt, for some technical, Matt Modisett has raised his hand, but for some technical reasons, I'm trying to unmute him, but I can't.
I was just waiting for a pause. I didn't know that he was
ready. Okay, so he is unmuted. So let me address Nikki, then we'll do Matt. So it is, if that's the scenario analysis guide, it's addressed to investment managers who are too far down the food chain to be that useful. We need to go to asset owners. There are 6 examples, so it's good we've got 6 examples, but if you read them, they are very model oriented, and the only model which, if you like, gives us any hope is the 6th one, which I think was probably Aberdeen or Standard or somebody from that stable. And it begins to speak about bespoke scenarios. One of the things I need to nail is that commonality of scenarios is often not helpful. It may be useful for regulators, but scenarios need to be fit for purpose. So the scenario fit for Prudential, he said, thinking of Rudolph, is probably not the scenario for Sainsbury's. Matt, over to you.
Just a quick note, Mike, we have about 3 minutes left, so I'd like to ask Matt and you both to be brief. Maybe we can answer. There are a couple more interesting questions remaining.
Sure.
I'll pass since I've had a chance. Next interesting question.
I'm waiting.
Sorry, I'll just start with Cedric's question. If we know how many megatons of CO2 have to be emitted to achieve 2 degrees of global warming, can we link to the amount of fossil fuels being extracted and somehow price the remaining carbon and tax economic activity accordingly? That's the question. And then I think he kind of says, which can't be happening because worldwide taxes are inapplicable.
Right. Let's unpick that. Worldwide taxes are inapplicable. We need to be careful with the world tax. We need to separate market price in an ETS from a tax. A tax is fiscal. In ETS is an attempt to make it a market price.
Sorry, then, what is ETS, Mike?
Emissions trading scheme. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so we've got a UK ETS, we've got a EU ETS, we've got ETSs, 2 in the States, RGGI, RGGI, and the West Coast one, I think.
So there are quite a few, yeah.
Well, there's, yes, and they're compliance markets. You'll also be familiar with voluntary carbon markets. That's Article 6 stuff, and that's a bit of a Wild West, but it's coming along. So let's go back to the question. The trouble is, we do not know. The assumption behind the question, we don't know what the carbon budget is because all these IPCC things are probabilities. So we could have spent the carbon budget. We don't know. And what we have to get used to is this idea of uncertainty, because we keep learning more, and frankly, the pessimistic scientists 3 years ago become mainstream, so sort of assume that it'll just get worse and worse. Yellen said in a speech a few weeks ago, it could be worse. When NGFS and the Financial Stability Board published a report in November, they sort of said it could be worse than we said previously. So assume for a while, the messaging will be, it's going to get worse. And I need to say one thing, because I only really thought about this recently. One of the problems is that we human beings think we're in control. We know nature's in control and we're not. So when people talk about subsidies, let's take the IRA, the big US act, and the EU response. They are not subsidies. They are, I suggest, citizens through their governments repaying the debt to nature that nature has offered us over previous decades. On that point, I need to hand back to you, Nikos.
Yes, I think we have, I'm afraid, Matt, and an anonymous attendee, we have run out of time. It's now 1 o'clock and we've run out of time. I'd like to thank very much Mike for a very interesting talk. I'd like to also thank Rulo for inviting Mike to give that talk, which was really engaging. And I'd like to thank all our audience for attending and for making this dialogue rather than a monologue. It was a very interesting session. Thanks very much, Mike.
I'd like to thank everybody. Well, I'd thank you for the invitation. So that's sort of you, and through that to Roloff to Noka. And, you know, this, I do a lot of this stuff. So if there's a way that people want to engage with this stuff more, I mean, please think how you want to arrange it, because this is important, especially to my 10 grandchildren. Yeah,
it is very important. I couldn't agree more.
So thank you.
Right, our next talk is on the 26th of May. Although another talk may be scheduled in the meantime. And the title is Now the Right Time for the Bulk Annuity Market? And is given by Nick Ford and Richard Wellard. And it's at 12 o'clock on the 26th of May. And on that note, thanks very much again, Mike. Thanks to all of our attendees, and have a good afternoon and a good weekend. Thanks, everybody, and bye-bye.
I'm happy to hang around for a couple of minutes, Nikos, if you want, just to do a bit of sort of, I don't know if you do a sort of review at the end.